Welcome to the MacArthur Memorial podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Williams. Join me as we explore the life and legacy of General of the Army Douglas MacArthur and discuss a wide range of military history topics from the American Civil War to the Korean War. Welcome to this MacArthur Memorial virtual program, and thank you for joining us. Our mission is to preserve and present the story of General Douglas MacArthur, the millions of men and women who served with him, and the world they lived in through free exhibits, education, research, and programs just like this one. We're very grateful for your interest and support. Tonight's topic addresses a deeply painful aspect of conflict, the rape and sexual assault of women and girls. General MacArthur was a veteran of several wars, and he understood that war and occupation create particular dangers for women and girls. On August 30th, 1945, as he flew into Atsugi just days before Japan's surrender, he told his staff that women's suffrage would be a priority of the occupation. In his view, Japan's stability depended on improving the legal, economic, and social status of women. Because of this, many American narratives portray the occupation as beneficial for Japanese women and girls. Another narrative has also developed over time, that occupation troops went on a rampage of mass sexual violence. And I would like to be clear, rapes by occupation forces did occur during the occupation, very likely at higher rates than reported at the time. Our focus today, however, is to investigate the narrative of orchestrated, widespread mass rapes by occupation troops, and to examine in some ways how General MacArthur's headquarters responded to issues of sexual violence and sex more broadly. Our speaker is Dr. Brian Walsh, author of The Rape of Japan, The Myth of Mass Sexual Violence During the Allied Occupation. Dr. Walsh teaches Japanese history and international relations at Kwansei Gakuen University, and his work focuses on the U.S.-Japanese relations in the 1940s and 1950s and the evolution of Japan's post-war identity. If you're watching live, please feel free to add questions in the comment section. We'll have time for Q&A after the presentation. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Walsh.
Good evening. My name is Brian Walsh, and I'm here today to talk to you about my book, The Rape of Japan. There are two stories described in this book. The first is about the behavior of U.S. troops, and particularly their treatment of Japanese women during the occupation. The second story basically uses the first as a case study of how historical legends can grow and become embedded in historiography, sometimes profoundly distorting our understanding of the past. So first, let's take a look at the particular. The behavior of American troops during the occupation had long been a source of pride among patriotic Americans. The general story went something like what we see in this image, that of good-natured young men representing the best of mid-20th century America and winning over Japanese civilians by the example of their cheerfulness and generosity. In the standard telling, the behavior of GIs established a foundation of goodwill that helped to make the occupation a success and presented to the Japanese people an object lesson in the benefits of a democratic society. In recent years, quite a different narrative has begun to emerge. Now, it is widely reported that during the first 10 days of the occupation, 1,336 rapes of Japanese women by American soldiers were reported in Kanagawa Prefecture alone. This figure appears in at least 7 published academic sources. Multiple scholars have written that the average number of reported rapes in 1945 was 40 daily. One adds that after General MacArthur placed brothels off limits to American troops, the number then skyrocketed to 330 a day. So this naturally raises the question of what really happened. The truth, of course, is that GIs were not the monsters that have been portrayed in much recent historiography, but neither were they all saints. In an army the size of the U.S. Army in Japan, there will inevitably be a criminal element. and it should come as no surprise that a certain number of criminals found themselves in uniform and on occupation duty in Japan. In an episode which largely escaped earlier heroic narratives of the occupation, those with criminal tendencies had ample opportunity for lawless behavior in the first days of the occupation. The Americans planned to move in light and fast. The priority was to secure the surrender by getting combat troops throughout the country as quickly as possible. In the words of Major General William C. Chase, commander of the 1st Cavalry Division, one of the first units into Japan, quote, "We planned an assault landing so we could be ready for anything." Naturally, in these circumstances, military police were not a priority. Making this already volatile situation worse was the fact that due to repeated requests of the Japanese government, MacArthur's general headquarters reversed its policy concerning military scrip. Yielding to Japanese entreaties, it agreed that the scrip that had already been issued to servicemen would not be valid. As a result, there were tens of thousands of armed young men set loose in a foreign country, largely without police supervision and having just discovered that their money was no good. The most frequently reported victims of American misbehavior were Japanese police, who had their swords and sidearms seized by GIs. Whether this was to disarm a potentially hostile force, seize souvenirs, or humiliate a beaten foe, this practice was so frequent in the opening days that it became necessary to distribute special flyers to prevent further incidents. Another major problem was joyriding. Americans committed a large number of thefts and some carjackings. In the Kanto area, which included the landing zones as well as the capital of Tokyo, there were a total of 750 vehicles, of which only 225 were gasoline-powered. All of them were nearly worn out. By the end of September, Americans had stolen 222 vehicles, including 5 fire engines. Inevitably, a disproportionate number of victims were high-placed and influential Japanese. 2 GIs stole a car from the Japanese Foreign Ministry. In another case, Americans took a welfare ministry vehicle at gunpoint. They also stole the car of Diet member Kono Hachiro. Another time, 2 Americans carjacked a vehicle in broad daylight right in front of the police headquarters in downtown Tokyo in Hibiya. One of the passengers in that car had been future Prime Minister Ikeda Hayato. In the highest profile case, a case which was never solved, a GI feigned illness to get future Prime Minister Kishi Nobusuke to drive him to the hospital in then serving Prime Minister Shidehara Kijiro's car. While they were en route, the American forced Kishi out of the car and drove off in the Prime Minister's vehicle. As late as the following June, in an incident that must surely have set a record of some sort, an American soldier held up and robbed future Prime Minister Ashida Hitoshi on a train from Tokyo to Kyoto. This may account for why so many of these crime victims, all of them relatively pro-American, may not have pushed back very hard against tales of rampant GI criminality when they became a political issue. In their experience, this was not very far from the truth. So, if there is a disproportionate number of crime victims among elite opinion makers, how do we get an accurate picture of what actually happened? Well, the first and easiest way is through the Japanese press. The media had more or less unfettered access to what was happening at the beginning of the occupation and were under no press restrictions until September 19th. The Asahi Shimbun ran a number of articles on GI crime. On September 2nd, it described the criminal actions on the first 2 days of the occupation. According to this account, there had been Americans had committed 2 rapes and had attempted 2 others. They also stole a Japanese sword, several bicycles, robbed a beer truck, and committed several other robberies. A September 7th article carried the most detailed information about GI crime, noting there was a fair amount of crime in the first 2 or 3 days, which caused a good deal of worry. However, due to an increase in the size of the U.S. military police force, the number of incidents had drastically decreased. Finally, on September 11th, The Asahi covered the entry of the Americans into Tokyo on the 8th and noted that up through the evening of September 9th, things had proceeded relatively smoothly. There was a total of 29 complaints against American officers and soldiers, and the article made a special point of the fact that no rapes had been committed. In fact, its title was Absolutely No Violation of Women. Another source into GI behavior in the opening days is the reports of the police. Police were brought from around Japan to the places where Americans would be moving in to observe the troops and to try to keep an eye on what was happening. According to police officer Hattori Ichiro, who was from Aichi Prefecture but was brought to Kanagawa Prefecture where the Americans made their first landings, quote, "The city was surprisingly quiet. As far as I am aware, there was no especially big trouble." In Kochi Prefecture on the island of Shikoku, the arrival of the troops was extremely peaceful. In Shizuoka, near Mount Fuji, the advance of the Allied armies was extremely peaceful. In Yamagata, on the Japan seacoast of northeastern Honshu, the strict discipline of the American troops completely allayed the fears of the populace. The situation was the same throughout the country. There was an initial period of uncertainty and anxiety, soon followed by reassurance at the discipline and relatively good behavior of the American troops. In addition, there are numerous accounts of civilians who observed the landings or the behavior of Americans in the opening weeks and months of the occupation. Some wrote about their experiences. One of those was Yamada Futaro. By December 1st, Yamada was so impressed that he wrote an entire entry about the behavior of Americans, recording his own impressions as well as those of people he talked with or overheard. He could barely contain himself, writing 4 pages of uninterrupted praise. Nagai Kaifu recorded an encounter at a restaurant where a number of young American officers were also dining. They seemed quite noble in their bearing and made efforts to communicate with Japanese in their own language. Nagai could not help but feel that they were far and away more genial than Japanese military men. Finally, we have fairly detailed Japanese police records. Here it should be noted that whether because of their own propaganda or the knowledge of what went on in territories occupied by the Imperial Army, Japanese were particularly concerned with rape. In fact, one set of reports on the Japanese side listed only 3 categories of crime: rape, offenses against the police, and other, in that order. Another lists rape, offenses against the police, and offenses against ordinary citizens, again, in that order. Because Japanese police kept records in this way, we actually have a clearer picture of the extent of at least reported rape during this period than we do of literally any other crime. And these records largely corroborate the testimony of both civilian and police observers. There was little violent crime, including rape. The most definitive evidence that we have of the actual level of reported criminality comes with this report that was sent to GHQ by the Japanese government's Central Liaison Office. The Central Liaison Office was an organ that was set up, composed mostly of former foreign ministry personnel, to carry on all of the dealings with between the Japanese government and GHQ. And they would send what they thought was important in English. In this reported crime to the end of September 1945, we find that there were a total of 14 rape cases and an additional 30 attempted rape cases. One of the reasons that the number of cases of rape was relatively low was that American commanders took them very seriously. On September 2nd, 1945, just after the surrender on the USS Missouri, General of the Army Douglas MacArthur met with his principal military subordinate, Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger. And the purpose of this meeting was for a conference concerning some reported rape cases on the part of Marines. It should be noted that according to Japanese police records, there was a total of 6 reported rape cases at this time. After the initial phases of the occupation, there is far less information on GI crime. GHQ imposed press censorship, and so after September 18th, 1945, the media no longer provides a window into American criminality. Moreover, the Japanese government seems to have, to a certain extent, lost interest after the initial period went relatively smoothly, and there are fewer records on the Japanese side. Nevertheless, there are still numerous sources that cover the subject. These include reports on GI crime from the Central Liaison Office, Japanese police reports, and Eighth Army Provost Marshal reports. Taken together, these can provide us with a fairly good picture of the extent of crime during the entirety of the occupation. This is an example of one of the statistical reports submitted by the Central Liaison Office. Here we have some internal public safety documents, public safety division reports that are based on the reports of Japanese police departments. Here are those original Japanese police department files that were sent in. And finally, we have Provost Marshal statistical reports. As I said, none of these by themselves gives us a window into the entirety of the occupation. However, when you put them all together, you can get a fairly good picture of what went on throughout the occupation. In fact, there's only a total of 6 months for which no data has been discovered. That was May and June of 1951, and January and April to 1952. However, assuming that whenever there are multiple figures, that the larger figure is correct, and that the figures for the months that we do not have are approximately the same average number of cases as the 10 months of 1951 for which data is available, then one arrives at a figure of about 1,082 reported cases of rape for the whole of the occupation, or an average of about 183 cases per year. This is, of course, not trivial, but it is undeniable that there is no reliable documentary evidence that there was mass sexual violence during the occupation. In fact, the figures that are presented here suggest that the rate of rape during the occupation as a whole was about the same as what occurs in an average mid-sized American city every year. So that's what really happened, or at least as far as we can determine from the surviving records. This leads to the question, where did all the tales of mass rape come from, and why did people believe in them? Part of this stems from the understanding of warfare in mid-20th century Japan. The idea that a foreign nation's women, whether as wives or temporary diversions, were the legitimate spoils of conquest was regarded as natural. A wartime study of the Japanese Health and Welfare Ministry put the matter bluntly. The fundamental principle of a relationship based on domination is that the males of the ruling or conquering nation marry females of the ruled or conquered nation. John Embry's classic study, A Japanese Village, shows that this understanding was not simply an idea of Tokyo bureaucrats, but permeated to the most basic levels of Japanese society. Embry described a carnival-like atmosphere greeting given to young men returning to the village from military training. The women of the village would dress as soldiers and tramps, and so disguised engage in behaviors they associated with men and soldiers, one of which was to try to rape the young schoolgirls. This understanding naturally affected the way Japanese perceived the coming Americans. The vast terror they experienced because of the fears of what they believed conquest involved are one of the reasons that they were so eager to cooperate with Americans. Even before the American landings, stories of mass rape were already circulating. Rumors involving rape, murder, emasculation, slavery, and other horrors circulated throughout the country. The prevalence of these stories is reflected by the frequency with which they appear in the reports of the Toko or the Special Hire Police. One rumor making the rounds had it that the Americans would impose a sexual levy, forcing the town committee to supply them with women from each household. Groundless rumors were so prevalent after the occupation began, one police report noted matter-of-factly that The violence and rape that were the subject of rumor has not taken place. Nevertheless, many Japanese refuse to, in essence, believe their lying eyes. For example, a farmer from Iwate Prefecture testified to police that even though they have been good-tempered, they get on my nerves every time I see them. I want them to go back as soon as possible. This good behavior must be some sort of a trick. Police reports show that there were persistent rumors that the good behavior of American troops was exactly that, or if not that, was at least highly unusual and due only to the luck of the draw. It was widely believed that though the particular group that was currently on duty in a given area just happened to be a good bunch, the unit that was coming to replace them was notoriously full of bad characters. In one such report, the Asahi Shimbun on December 12th claimed to have interviewed an American soldier. And when asked about what would happen when they were replaced with the next group, the soldier allegedly responded that he doesn't know how it will go when the gang that doesn't have sufficient training came in to replace him and his fellows. Throughout the country, there was a general feeling that the lack of violence was peculiar, and it was something that happened only in their political particular locale. This is found even in police histories. Thus, we read that the advance of the American army into Hokkaido was more tranquil than in other locales. In Yamagata, from what we heard afterward, it seems that the troops that came at this time were model soldiers. The people of our prefecture were truly blessed. Shimane apparently had similar luck. Fortunately, the unit that came to our area was composed of disciplined stalwarts. Regardless of the behavior of the actual Americans in their midst, it is clear that some Japanese, like the Iwate farmer, were clearly looking for any pretext to nurse a grievance against their occupiers. Some people would not have had to look far, for there was one conspicuous facet of the occupation that many found both distasteful and humiliating. In many ways, both the behavior and the policies of the conquerors were a challenge to traditional Japanese notions of masculinity. From the supreme commander on down, Americans were seen as a challenge to Japanese men. This began with high policy. One of General MacArthur's clear individual contributions to Japan was to enfranchise and establish the full legal equality of Japanese women in the new constitution. Significantly, this reform was not included in any of his instructions from Washington and was undertaken by the Supreme Commander on his own initiative. Though MacArthur had it in mind to extend the franchise to women, the extraordinary extent of the constitutional guarantees to women were in large part the result of the efforts of a remarkable young woman, Beata Shirota. That story deserves far more time than I have to give it here, but suffice it to say that due to the changes she authored, there has been no need for any constitutional revision on the subject of women's rights from 1946 to the present day, despite the seismic shifts that have occurred in women's social roles during that time. These changes, at least in formal legal terms, overthrew the traditional structure of the Japanese household and eliminated it as the fundamental building block of Japanese society, a role that was now the prerogative of the individual citizen, be they male or female. Despite the objection of many conservative Japanese men that women would not know what to do with the right to vote, they very soon began exercising their newly recognized rights. This was a shock to many Japanese men, even to those who were ostensibly progressive in their politics. During debates on the new constitution, the right-wing socialist leader, Nishio Suehiro, confronted feminist Kato Shizue about the changes which she supported. "You're a terrible person," Nishio berated her. "You're trying to tear down the family system." And in the eyes of Nishio and many others in Japan, the terrible people in Japan had their backing from MacArthur's GHQ. Another thing that seemed to be an insult to Japanese men was, in many ways, the inevitable result of the demographic catastrophe of losing the war. At the end of the war, there was a population surplus of 1.4 million women in the age range of 20 to 39. This resulted in a sex ratio of more than 114 women for every 100 men. One obvious source to make up the shortfall was the foreign men of the occupation forces. The result was that scenes of American servicemen with Japanese women, which even to our eyes look slightly comic, must have struck many Japanese men as downright revolting. To many, the Americans, with their sermonizing about women's rights and their often ostentatious deference to women, were nothing more than crass sexual opportunists, poaching women who were not rightfully theirs. Their very presence was an attack on Japanese sexual morality itself. To these men, the Americans were nothing if not rapists. The women, of course, were all prostitutes, or as they were soon called, ponpon. Very shortly, the political opportunities inherent in this resentment would be seized by the anti-American left. In 1951, after internal squabbling, the Japanese Communist Party came together to announce a new program. The party officially rejected the idea that liberation and democratic growth and expansion can be obtained through peaceful means. They decided to raise the consciousness of the average Japanese about the slavery-like oppression of the occupation policies. However, with the economy booming at that time, this was no easy task. So the communists made an appeal on something that, while not true, felt that way to many. Women are even forced to become prostitutes. In this campaign, the communists were joined by left-wing socialists in their anti-American propaganda, with one of the most vocal participants being diet woman Fujiwara Michiko. Propaganda came out in left-wing publication, including the JCP party organ Akahata. At about this time, foreigners living in Japan began to attempt to raise the alarm about anti-American rape-themed propaganda, and they soon became very frustrated by the lack of pushback. On March 6, 1953, that is the day after Stalin's death, Akahata carried an article which was sure to reach a very wide audience. In it, they claimed that Americans had forced some 4,000 women who worked at the Tachigawa base to undergo a VD test, and 60% were positive. Moreover, it claimed that the extraordinarily high positive rate was because the American servicemen had a practice of gang raping these women and infecting them with VD. A number of writers, either out of ideological sympathy or simply interest in cashing in on an increasingly popular genre, soon joined the effort. One of the earliest and most prominent was Kanzaki Kiyoshi. During the war, Kanzaki had written pro-war propaganda for schoolgirls under a pen name. According to his own recollection, during the occupation, he watched well-fed and well-dressed Japanese women cavorting with Americans, and it filled him with a deep sense of humiliation and resentment. That began to change the course of his career, and in April 1949, Kanzaki started writing articles on prostitution, sexual promiscuity, and relations between Japanese women and American men, and all the attendant evils thereto. He published in any venue that would have him, and he clearly blamed the Americans for the situation. Kanzaki supported and sometimes collaborated with socialist diet woman Fujiwara Michiko, and he also joined the Communist Party. Kanzaki wrote so many stories that are simply not credible. There's not time to give a fully representative sampling, but in one such story, he has it that a group of American sailors on the eve of the occupation were out in Tokyo Bay off the coast of Yokosuka, and after years of fighting, they simply could no longer restrain themselves before they, at long last, presumably, realized their life's ambitions of taking Japanese women from their men, abandoned their stations, commandeered boats of an unspecified kind from an unknown source, and came ashore in search of women. This all before there was any troops securing the land at all. One of the most consequential efforts in this campaign was the book Nippon no Teiso, or The Chastity of Japan. This was first published in March 1953 at just about the time that Akahata was carrying lurid tales of rape on American bases. It was heavily promoted in a nationwide advertising campaign. Subtitled journals of women raped by the foreign troops, it was clearly aimed at the Americans. Richard L.G. Deverell, an anti-communist labor advisor for GHQ, was alarmed by the publication of the book, and he wrote, quote, "This book fires paper bullets, and the bullets are aimed one way, America. That is the real significance of the chastity of Japan," end quote. This book also contains numerous obvious fabrications, and in 1999, the literature scholar Michael Molaskey showed definitively that the book was a hoax. In my own research, I found out that the publisher, Nakiri Tetsuo, had essentially admitted in an interview that the work was bogus many, many years earlier. Nevertheless, it was taken and became a foundation of the anti-base movement in Japan. Incidentally, the editor of that book, Mizuno Hiroshi, has been lost to history, and no one has been able to find out who he is. However, one possible candidate is Goto Tsutomu, who would later write as Goto Ben. He was commissioned to write the sequel to Chastity of Japan, and he had quite a vivid imagination. In the sensationalist magazine Shinso, Goto related an episode allegedly from the Battle of Iwo Jima. In that episode, a Captain Martin of the 6th Marines rallied his men with the following rousing harangue. "You braves, after Jap just broken here, nobody can't impede your road to Tokyo. Tokyo, many girls of peach are waiting to be conquered. Jap girls all given you, now go for break." According to Goto, it seems that just the very thought of girls of peach drove these men to superhuman efforts. The 6th Marines moved on to carry the battle and annihilate the Japanese garrison, which was no small achievement considering that they were on Saipan at the time. But Goto was never much concerned with accuracy. Goto also wrote about Nostradamus, how aliens built human civilization, how Japan had developed the atomic bomb before the United States but refused to use it for humanitarian reasons, and most disturbingly, how Adolf Hitler had been a great prophet who foresaw the future up to the year 2039. Both Goto's book and Mizuno's, whoever he was, were widely distributed at the expense of the socialists and communists in the pursuit of a number of their various campaigns. Another writer who is often referred to on the subject of relations between American men and Japanese women is Kaburagi Seiichi. He is such a shady figure that the only photograph I could find of him is in an expose about a financial fraud he had been involved in. Put simply, none of these writers can be considered serious or reliable. Many of their works do not even qualify as good fiction. They suffer from internal inconsistencies, impossible timelines, first-person testimonies that suddenly slip into the omniscient viewpoint, Americans with names like Barbary, Chart, Hebine, Sheridan, or Captain Proud, and the testimonials of victims who died from their ordeals. Some stories simply border on pornographic self-parody. In one episode, it was alleged that a group of female American personnel from the Women's Auxiliary Corps kidnapped a Japanese police officer, confined him for 3 days, and continually forced themselves on the hapless lawman. Despite their patent absurdity, such works began to feature prominently in journalistic and popular accounts of sexual relations between Japanese women and American servicemen during the occupation from about the 1970s. Even the official Kanagawa Prefectural Police history, an otherwise generally reliable source, excerpts Goto for more than a full page. From there, it would be a short step into mainstream academic historiography. For many years, these stories were in the background and embraced by certain extremists, at that time mostly on the left elements, but they had little effect on mainstream understanding. However, over the decades, as those with personal experience of the occupation began to fade, popular and journalistic accounts on the subject of sexual violence during the occupation began to cite many of the works of Pon literature of the 1950s. These works then made it into the historiographical mainstream when they were cited in academic literature. From there, they have completely transformed the image of GI behavior during the occupation. A number of scholars, both Japanese and American, are responsible for this metamorphosis. Here, I'm going to talk primarily about two because of their outsized influence. One of the first writers to use popular or journalistic accounts based on Pon literature was Yuki Tanaka. In his 1996 book, Hidden Horrors, Tanaka first introduced the story about there having been 1,336 reports of rape just in Kanagawa Prefecture in the first 10 days of the occupation. American scholar Roger Brown looked into Tanaka's citation for this figure, pointed out that it had gone through a chain of citations in which the meaning had been distorted in each successive iteration, and concluded that the figure was unreliable. In 2004, he posted this conclusion to the internet forum H Japan. In response to this post, Tanaka published a temporary self-retraction, writing, quote, "In my book, Hidden Horrors, I used only secondary sources to discuss the issue of rape by soldiers of the American occupation forces in immediate post-war Japan. When writing this book, I was living in Australia and did not have easy access to original sources. Shortly after the book was published, I became aware that the statistical information I obtained through Yamada's book was somewhat dubious. In a deliberate effort to amend this situation, I made sure that I used mainly original sources in Chapter 5, Sexual Violence Committed by the Allied Occupation Forces Against Japanese Women, 1945 to 1946, of my latest book, Japan's Comfort Women." So he essentially admitted in 2004 that he'd made a mistake and used a dubious source. However, when it came time to reissue this book in a second edition, which did contain a number of amendments or corrections, the language about the rapes in Kanagawa was kept in, and it was identical, or nearly so. The other thing is that Tanaka pointed to his latest book at that time, Japan's Comfort Women, as using primary sources that would be far more reliable than the book he had previously used. Nevertheless, he then starts his discussion of victim testimony by asserting that the most reliable sources on the subject are Japan's Chastity and Japan's Chastity, a sequel. And both of these works are, of course, as we discussed, transparently fraudulent. The latter is the work of a notorious charlatan and neo-Nazi. Likely the former is as well. Worse, that is made obvious in the introduction of the very work Tanaka deems one of the most reliable on his subject. In its third paragraph, it rails about the elite group of Jews manipulating the American leadership to use several dozen atomic bombs to achieve the total annihilation of the Japanese race. Despite this anti-Semitic nonsense, Tanaka, who is himself married to a Jewish woman, treats Goto as a reliable authority. Altogether, in a total of 195 notes in 2 chapters, Tanaka either directly or indirectly cites the fraudulent sources detailed in the previous chapter, or the previous section rather, no fewer than 56 times. That is more than a quarter of the total. This includes a staggering 17 out of the 19 notes in the section he titles Testimonies of Victims of Sexual Violence Committed by Occupation Troops. Another scholar who has an outsized effect on the way this issue is perceived is John Dower. His Embracing Defeat was a publishing sensation. It won numerous awards and was the first exposure of many readers to occupation history. It is a singularly influential book. While the section of this work that deals with prostitution and sexual violence makes up a very small part of the whole, it has powerfully shaped popular and scholarly perception of these issues. However, Dower's coverage of these subjects is almost wholly dependent on dubious or fraudulent sources. This is because he has relied mostly on latter-day secondary sources. Naturally, these secondary sources include a large number of the myths constructed in the Pon literature of the 1950s. The result is that a good deal of myth makes its way into Dower's presentation. The most outrageous example comes in a mind-boggling footnote about rape by American soldiers. Discussing the Japanese government initiative to establish brothels for American troops, a story which has been the source of nearly as many legends as sexual violence has, Dower wrote, "The incidence of rape remained relatively low, given the huge size of the occupation force, much as the government had hoped." He then provides the following footnote. According to one calculation, the number of rapes and assaults on Japanese women amounted to around 40 daily, while the government brothels were in operation and then rose to 330 a day after it was terminated in early 1946. Personally, I don't see that 40 daily is a relatively low rate. But nevertheless, this is the source of this figure being incorporated into mainstream historiography. And though it takes some sleuthing to track down through a long chain of citations, it turns out that Dower's ultimate source for this claim is the neo-Nazi crackpot Goto Ben. Elsewhere, Dower has directly cited Pon literature. In a footnote, he writes the most widely cited author dealing with prostitution in post-war Japan is Kanzaki Kiyoshi, whose various findings are summarized in his Baishun Keteiban Kanzaki Reporto. Some of the data in this valuable report must be used with care. Nevertheless, this care is not evident in his use of Kanzaki, whose outrageous and often demonstrably false claims Dower uncritically uses in the construction of his narrative. Dower also claimed that prostitutes who served Japanese clients and those who served American clients jealously guarded their clientele, and that when anyone transgressed these racial boundaries, they could be subject to abuse or even torture by other prostitutes. While it is not beyond the realm of possibility, I have seen no credible evidence of such torture in any of the sources I've looked at. Moreover, Dower's description about prostitutes torturing one another bears a very strong resemblance to scenes from the novel Gate of Flesh by Tamaro Tajiro. Significantly, Dower provides no citation for this assertion. It seems that literature and fiction and fact have become conflated. Yuki Tanaka has identified himself as an activist who has long been involved in the anti-U.S. military bases movement, and he presents his understanding of U.S.-Japanese relationship in the following terms. The Japanese government, always subservient to U.S. military power, continues to agree to U.S. demands eagerly. John Dower was a charter member of the Committee of Concerned Asian Scientists, or Scholars, and where the U.S.-Japanese relationship is concerned, Dower wrote, "We oppose continuation of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, which has compromised Japanese independence by turning Japan into a bulwark of American empire in Asia and forcing her into a posture of hostility to China." In leading this opposition, Dower himself penned an explicit endorsement of the National Front tactics employed by the communists and left-wing socialists in their anti-American campaign of the 1950s, the very campaign that produced Nippon no Teiso, that is, The Chastity of Japan, and its sequel. It is clear that for both of these activist scholars, the equation of Japan's international subordination to the United States with being a victim of sexual violence passed from literary metaphor to historical fact. Nevertheless, it would be a mistake to look on them as outliers. For those who have objected to the post-war U.S.-Japanese relationship, the conceit of sexual subordination is so common as to be almost cliché. In the immediate post-war period, the scholar Maruyama Masao lamented the ethos of naked egoism that had seized Japan and asserted that in comparison to other Asian countries, where a spirit of nationalism was awakening the people, Japan had the broken spirit of a helpless pon-pon. Ishihara Shintaro wrote, "The security alliance is nothing more or less than a scheme by which America unilaterally rapes the very state itself. Japan has become like a teenage prostitute that America uses for its own gratification." Tokura Kyuichi denounced the government policies as forcing the Japanese people to adopt the character of a supine prostitute. Testifying before the Diet concerning the issue of rearmament, Kanzaki Kiyoshi referred to the recently founded Police Reserve, a body that would eventually evolve into Japan's self-defense forces, as the bastard mixed-race child of the occupation. Shirasujiro, who had extensive dealings with GHQ in negotiation over the American-authored draft of the Constitution, described his experience to an associate as akin to being locked up and raped, with the Constitution being nothing more than that bastard half-breed that resulted. For many years, for many Japanese, the American remaking of their country in the wake of World War II was an experience that was almost as traumatic as defeat itself. Yasuoka Akio, the artist who drew this image, said, It was like our whole value system was overturned in the middle of the night. This image depicting a woman naked but for an American flag is captioned Shofu Okinawa, or Okinawa the prostitute. Recalling that of all his cartoons, it was the one of which he was proudest, he also lamented the energy of those days slowly ebbing as the ruling Liberal Democratic Party embraced the United States more tightly. In truth, he said, it should have been captioned Japan the prostitute. Some writers seem to find these narratives of sexual domination so appealing that they resort to downright conspiracist thinking in order to maintain their suspension of disbelief. Shibata Hideaki, in his 2022 book Sendyoki no Seibōryoku, Sexual Violence During the Occupation, wrote extensively about all the rape allegedly going on during the occupation. He then noted that Japanese keeping journals like Yamada Futaro did not note any mass rape, and in fact, on the contrary, wrote that Americans were very well behaved. Apparently, this was because Yamada was servile. Hardest of all for Shibata to reconcile himself with was the fact that Beata Sirota, the supposed champion of rights of women in Japan, wrote nothing whatsoever on the subject of all that rape. It was, in Shibata's eyes, very strange indeed. It is beyond dispute that something strange is going on with accounts of mass rape and sexual exploitation during the American occupation of Japan, but it has nothing to do with Beata Sirota. Edward Gibbon once observed, the most incredible stories are the best adapted to the genius of an enraged people. The resentment many Japanese felt about defeat in the Second World War and their country's subsequent inability to emerge from the shadow of its conqueror provided an ample foundation of ire upon which to build a number of legends. One of those legends was that GIs perpetrated mass rape and widespread sexual atrocity. The endurance of these legends and their close association with anti-American activists is an ample proof that no small measure of resentment persists. While these legends are mostly nonsense, the concerns and questions about U.S.-Japanese relations that inspire them are not necessarily so. American policymakers would be wise to take note of the nationalist indignation that roils the spirits of Japanese across the political spectrum. This, however, does not mean entertaining the fantastic tales of sexual predation such indignation inspires. Such accounts are best regarded as metaphoric expressions of the experience of national humiliation rather than as serious history. They are, in other words, incredible stories adapted to the genius of an enraged people. And with that, I will end my presentation. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Walsh. We've got some questions that we are teeing up at the moment. For our audience members, if you have a question for Dr. Walsh, please put those in the comment section. We're in the process of teeing those up. What archives did you explore for your book?
Most of the research I did was actually in the National Archives in Maryland. There's a lot of information there about, a lot of the Japanese records were turned in there. I also did research in the National Diet Library in Tokyo and at the National Archives in Japan. And there were a few things that I looked at in the National Defense Library Archive in Japan and the National Diplomatic Archive in Japan.
Next question. Someone wants to know, where did you find the Central Liaison Office records?
Those are actually in a couple of places. The one place is that you will find them scattered throughout the Records Group 331 in the GHQ SCAP records in the National Archives, but they've also been collected and put into published volumes by Takemai Eiji. You can find those published volumes in mostly in libraries in Japan. They have the published volumes of the CLO records and the correspondence between the Japanese government and GHQ.
Next question. And hopefully you should be able to see this question at the bottom.
Is there any truth to the alleged rumor that there was a secret prison in Japan where SCAP service members who committed violent crimes were secretly executed off the books? I am aware of no such setup. And I do know of a number of high-profile cases of violent crimes, including, I've forgotten the gentleman's rank. His name wasn't a gentleman, the criminal's rank, a man by the name of Hickswa, who had believed that he had been cheated because he didn't get to experience combat. So he decided he was just going to murder two random Japanese in a park in Nara. And then he was taken to prison. He escaped prison. That he was eventually recaptured. And very, very oddly, he became the focus of a sympathy campaign that included a large number of Japanese pushing President Truman to pardon him. Truman eventually sort of bowed to the pressure to a certain extent. He ended up getting 30 years of hard labor. But my understanding is that the violent crimes, especially for high-profile crimes, were relatively well known, at least in the United States. I am not sure about the rules describing those in the Japanese press. I do believe that when a suspect was convicted, rather than just accused of a crime, that the Japanese media was then allowed to report on the conviction.
I don't think I've come across any off-the-books sort of justice system during the occupation, at least in terms of the occupation forces. But I think a lot of the, like you said, the violent crime, it's taken very seriously. It's part of a formal justice process within the military. And then I think you're right. I think when the verdict is decided, that's when it is shared. So no, and I think there's only a handful of people that actually are executed during the occupation for, I think, again, violent crimes like murdering Japanese civilians and things like that. But it's a relatively small number that we actually have documented, at least here. We're going to tee up another question. Let me throw one out there, though, right now. Your work mostly focuses on the Japanese mainland. Do you think some of your arguments also apply for Okinawa, or is that a different situation?
I'm just going to say right now that I have speculations about Okinawa and how it's been presented there, but I am not in a position to offer anything better than a well-informed layperson's guess. So I'm not going to enter into that because that's beyond my area of competence.
Understood. Next question. What was the usual consequences of committing a rape by a GI?
So the usual consequences of committing a rape by the GIs. I actually don't have a whole lot of information about this, but I do know that in the cases that I saw, there was one case which was a gang rape. This was one of the crimes that actually happened in that initial phase of semi-lawlessness at the opening of the occupation. There were 3 soldiers that were involved in that, and I can't prove it because I don't have the names of those soldiers, but within a month, there was a judgment on the soldiers, and they were accused of Article of War 93, which I believe is rape or murder and carries a mandatory sentence of death or hard labor for life. They were acquitted of Article of War 93 and found guilty of Article of War 92, which led them to be sentenced to 10 years of confinement with hard labor. I don't have enough of a source base to tell you how representative that case was, but I do get the feeling that courts martial were reluctant to impose the death penalty, and that they would, even when the evidence suggested a stronger conviction, that they would tend to opt for the lesser penalty of Article of War 92. I do know that the Criminal Investigation Division could be fairly thorough in their investigations. There was a particularly egregious case of a 10-year-old girl who was abducted from the gates of the Imperial Palace and raped by 2 Americans. And they were then subjected to blood tests, polygraphs, a number of other things until one of them finally confessed. And the final verdict on that particular report said investigation is continuing. And now I can't prove this, but my belief is that that was an example of the essentially the prosecutors trying to make sure that they got them on Article of War 93, that they were going to get a strong conviction on that, which would seem to indicate that there might have been some lenience coming from the top. But I don't have an overall picture of how much was carried out at that point. I'd have to look more into the Judge Advocate General records, and I've not done that at this point.
Okay. There is a question as if you ever...
does my book cover rape in Okinawa during the Perry expedition? It does not. I have not looked into that.
I believe there is one incident during that time, and I think it does shape somewhat the U.S.-Japanese relationship in some interesting ways at that time. And I think one thing that struck me about your book was how much this narrative of this type of crime does even today continue to shape kind of the U.S. and Japan relationship. Let's see. All right, here's the next question. If you want to read this and then answer it.
Okay, have other American scholars taken up John Dower's claim, and has that changed the consensus among American historians? Dower has been, in my understanding, basically elevated to the status of the Dean of American Historians of the Occupation. As I said, his book, Embracing Defeat, was, it was a publishing event. It shaped the history of the occupation was seen for a long time. He was actually the one who inspired me to get into occupation studies, and so his claims about rape in particular, I know, have been picked up by other scholars. Both Ian Buruma and Thomas U. Berger cite him as the authority that there were 40 cases of rape daily throughout 1945. And that's in the sort of academic literature. If you are to go to the, wild wilderness of online places, you will see that figure in dozens, if not hundreds, of sites.
Okay. Just a few more questions, if you'd like to read and answer the next one.
So the Time of Fallen Blossoms, that is actually one of the references that Dower makes in his chapter on the sexual violence and prostitution in Japan. And I see absolutely no reason not to credit that. As I said, there were, at least that we know of, 1,082 cases of rape that were reported. And some of those were quite egregious. It should come as no surprise that there are credible accounts of rape in Japan. This is, it's a problem in really any human society, and there's no reason that we would expect occupation Japan to be an exception to that rule. The real question is, was there a degree of mass violence the way that we saw, for example, in Manila or Nanjing or those other places, which is what is often suggested.
Okay. Last question. I'll let you read that and then you can answer it.
Okay. So basically, the way I characterized the rate, and this is actually a very difficult question because apples to apples comparisons are nearly impossible. So if you look at the reported cases of rape in mid-sized American cities in the early 21st century, they come up to about the same number as reported cases of rape in Japan during the occupation. Now, the question is, what were the barriers to reporting? What percentage of attacks were actually reported? Were there more reported because civilians had been strongly encouraged, especially in the opening phases of the occupation, to report anything? Or were there fewer because of the cross-cultural shame and the, added humiliation of defeat? Moreover, has the definition of rape and what people report as rape in the United States grown more? So I cannot say with certainty. I can say that the raw numbers are about the same. and that the rate of rape came out to about 183 cases per year. I did look at provost marshal records. I looked at very few court-martial records. I was more interested in getting an overall statistical grasp on the scale of the problem rather than the details of each individual case.
Okay, let me throw out one last question for you. We know that rapes are typically underreported, as you said, for a variety of reasons. How do we as historians account for that? I mean, obviously there's the official record, but if we think that that might be artificially low, how do we treat that as historians?
The short answer is that you really can't. You cannot come up with a definitive answer because the constellation of sociological factors that goes into that overcoming that barrier is virtually unknowable. And you would have to you have to go back in time, even in today's society. One of the ways that we can do that is we can put out anonymous surveys and then look at that compared to reported cases of rape and then make a comparison based thereon, assuming that people are going to answer more honestly to anonymous surveys. You really can't do that with the past. And so you do have to take into consideration factors that you know. In this case, we know that there was a very aggressive push to report anything related with rape. And I need to put a caveat on that in the opening phases of the occupation. I don't know that that continued afterwards. And there's a distinct possibility that the police were considerably less enthusiastic about getting reports in after that initial phase when they were just trying to prevent a catastrophe. And once things became in order, they could have just regarded some Japanese women as a nuisance or creating trouble where none had to be. That sort of thing certainly goes on. That went on in Japan just, I want to say a few years ago. It's probably more than that. But within the last 10 or 15 years, there was an Australian woman who had been raped by a American serviceman. And the Japanese police basically did nothing to help her because this was going to create trouble, and they had less sympathy for her, I guess, because she was not Japanese. So it's possible that you got that sort of attitude increasingly crept in, especially as Japan and the United States became closer in terms of their international alliance, and they didn't want to create friction. But at the end of the day, all of that is speculation. I don't know. But, you do have to actually think about these things to at least try to anticipate what are the possible barriers to understanding the true extent of the crime.
Well, there's a lot of nuance to it, too. So it's a complicated story to tell. Thank you, Dr. Walsh, for taking the time to share your research with us. We are very grateful for your time. And we just want to thank everyone who joined us. We have an ever-expanding slate of upcoming virtual programs, and you can find out more information about those on our website, www.macarthurmemorial.org. And we hope that you all will join us again for another virtual event. We hope you enjoyed that episode. If you have questions, comments, or topic suggestions, the MacArthur Memorial team wants to hear from you. You can reach us at macarthurmemorial@norfolk.gov or find us on X at MacArthur1880 or on Facebook and Instagram as MacArthur Memorial.